Hey fam. Uh, so yeah, I'm a little tired today. um, but I don't know, a couple quick notes. I'm gonna be trying to dress a little bit nicer. So over Christmas, my family was nice enough to get me. Actually, you can kind of see back there. If you can't already tell, some more clothes, so I can try to at least be a little more fashionable. Um, and Lord, I got some work done last night and this morning, but I was largely distracted by like the video I posted yesterday didn't blow up per se, but it was definitely it got a lot more traction than I normally get, and there are a lot of dislikes. I mean, like there are a lot of likes too, but like just very controversial. Um, and I didn't see a lot of comments to indicate why. I rewatched it to see if there was anything that I said which could be read in a negative light. And right now, I mean, I tried to do it justice. But comment back in that video or down here to just let me know if I should do a follow up or if I should clarify or whatever. Because I tried to be fair, right? And I only mean Natalie well, and I hope that she's alright, and yada yada. Yeah, so anyway, moving onward. So, today's topic. Um, what I wanted to talk about, and I sort of thought about this while I was at home, right? So I made a video about coming out, my relationship to people who I visited at home, um, and I talked a little bit yesterday about the conversation I had with my brother while I was home. I kind of want to put a pin on my home as a subject with today's video talking about my experience being closeted and growing up where I did, right? I've talked about it before, but the recap, I grew up in the Midwest, in Ohio, in a semi conservative small town, right? I say semi conservative because it's that type of conservative which exists where people identify more so as libertarian or centrist because they grow up in such an area where there really are not any problems of identity, right? Um, or any major economic problems, right? So there's really only white people of the same religion, predominantly, who follow the same sort of cultural norms, and uh, who are largely heterosexual and cis, right? Most people are employed, have some form of housing, or if they don't have employment, are supported by their family, right? That describes a couple friends who I have, right? Um, to that extent, there's very few black people or brown people altogether. There's very few people of other faiths. There are very few LGBT people, and there's like no homelessness or poverty, right? And so the people there are interesting, and I've thought about this a lot because they are largely good people. Like, I came out, as I said in another video, and they went over really well, right? And I think a large part of that just has to do with the fact that before I came out, I had a really good relationship with the people who were from that community. And if anyone from that community is watching right now, know that I say all this just not to be offensive whatsoever, quite the opposite. It's just as a point of education, right? Um, because this is going to be an especially relevant conversation going into this next year with, you know, the political election, especially gonna, going the way it is, and impeachment and all that, right? Because when I was home over this winter break, I noticed that there are a lot of people. Like, I'm glad that the subject didn't come up too much because when it did, people usually were pretty quick to get a little defensive or to take one side or the other, right? And really, I was the only person. I was the only person who I talked to. Um, I shouldn't say that. There were a couple friends who I spoke to who approached it from the same angle that I did, but I was really the only person that even remotely supported impeachment, which is crazy, right? I shouldn't say that's crazy, right? There's a lot of people in the country who believe that, and that largely has to do with where they get their information from, the people that they surround themselves with, so on and so forth, right? If you watch mostly Fox News and you are largely around people who are centrist or conservative, you probably aren't going to believe that impeachment is viable right now, or at least that's warranted, right? Perhaps you're of the belief that it is warranted, but that it won't get past the Senate trial, and that's a whole nother discussion, right? About whether or not the House should still have pursued the things that it did, with the chances that they have of a Senate trial succeeding or not, right? That's a whole nother discussion. And that's fair, right? But there are a lot of people who I spoke to who were like outright opposed to it. And I kind of want to dig into like the nature of the politics of the town and growing up there and how it's shaped me as a person, right? So to begin this discussion, we have to sort of go back a little bit to when I was younger, right? I have known that I'm trans since like as far back as I can remember, right? People who knew me when I was younger knew me to be a more awkward kid, right? Which is crazy, I know. And I can still sometimes be a little awkward, but I mean, now that I'm out, right? And I mean, like, over the course of the last 5-6 years of my life, I have gotten to be much more confident in general, right? As I've been living on my own and developing as a person and yada yada. But it is massively easier now that I'm out because for especially my early childhood, I really didn't know how to do boy, right? It was actually, funny or weird or however you want to look at it, tragic, in that when I was growing up, like I was way overthinking every single conversation I had to the point where I sort of had like a stutter or like a delayed reaction. And the reason why that was because I actually had to go through, like for me, before I could really process like why I was experiencing this and why I was the way that I was, like my thinking process at the time was basically like, holy crap, how do all these boys around me know what to say so intuitively and so fluidly, right? Like how do all these kids, how can they all be so comfortable, being like this, right? And so I literally had to like be that awkward friend, and eventually I was able to gravitate towards a group of kids and just like learn how to do that, and almost practice talking to the point where I understood sort of how to at least function. But even during my high school years, when I was more social, people would sometimes describe me as like robotic. In fact, that's something that followed me a bit through college when I was doing mock trial. That was something I always got criticized for, was for being like robotic. And the reason was because I overanalyzed every single little thing that I did to the point where it would almost like slow down my mental processing. Or not slow it down, but like overload it to the point where I'd have trouble articulating what my brain wanted my body to do, right? I would almost freeze up, if that makes sense. Maybe other people who are trans who are watching can relate to that. But yeah, so I was a very shy and very awkward kid growing up. And I knew I was trans early on, or at least I knew that I was a girl or that I wanted to be born as one, right? I say that because, I was able to at least piece that together pretty early on when I was, because I had the internet, right? I was fortunate enough that, I was given access to a computer when I was relatively young. And it was a private computer to boot, And so, And eventually I just sort of Googled, right? Like I would have dreams about it, and I would think about it constantly, and I would dream about, and so eventually I just Googled, like, how to turn into a woman, or how to be a woman, or like, those sorts of things. And eventually back in like the early 2010s, found some results on the internet, but back then the results were not great, right? Back then people still used terms like transvestite and similar titles and trigger words, which you don't need to get into. Use your imagination, or don't if it is sensitive for you, right? But yeah. So when I was younger and I saw that, I was scared to death, because I saw some transition results, and they didn't make me feel better about my prospects. And so basically I just saw as what I was going through as a mental illness, which, if I get large enough that I have alt-right people following me, they will surely bully me and harass me, saying that exact same thing, right? And eventually I got enough wherewithal to realize that that's a load of horseshit, and that's completely wrong, and I'm fine as a person. But that's what I thought at the time when I was growing up, and so I became very ashamed of myself, right? And so basically my mentality was, all right, so I have this thing that I'm dealing with, and if I try to come to terms with it, it could only go over poorly. Both because, there's negative recognition for people who do try to deal with that sort of a problem through what transition was back then. And also the fact that I recognize that I grew up in not the most accepting town. I mentioned before that I was a very awkward kid, and that I ended up speaking very awkwardly in a lot of situations, and that manifested in such a way where a lot of people teased me about my intellect, right? And called me names, which we will not get into here. But yeah, it was rough, and I was a lonely kid, and I wanted anything. I wanted to not be so lonely anymore, and I wanted that more than anything, right? I wanted to be respected and just liked by other people. And so what I did was I recognized, so with being trans, I recognized that people who generally go through it at the time didn't have the greatest results or quality of life afterwards, and B, that I lived in the town where if I did that, then it could realistically, at least in my opinion at the time, and I think this is probably justified, only go over poorly, right? Like I even talked with my parents about it when I was home, and they said, yeah, we probably would have had to have moved to like another school system entirely, right? Because it was a different time back then. It's crazy. Sorry, I have a bit of cold. So yeah, basically what I did for the majority of the time when I was in my hometown growing up was I was operating with this mentality of, okay, so since I cannot do transition, right, since I cannot do this thing which I know would make me happy, then really only two other options remained. A content warning, suicide. One of the things I thought about was suicide, right? And weirdly enough, I actually only considered it briefly. I have this memory of when I was younger. And this is just the way that my family operates. The mentality I'm about to describe to you is just what I went with. And I definitely do not... I'm not advocating for other people to adopt it either. But this is just my experience. I remember there was a time when I was younger and I was over at my yaya's house. And I've talked about my yaya before. She's my best friend. She's the person I look up to. She is a wonderful, awesome person in my life, right? And I remember bringing up the subject of suicide to her just passingly, right? Like I was just interested in sort of what she thought because, again, I really wanted to be respected and liked and loved and all that. And so I wasn't going to take my life if it meant that my family would think less of me because of it, or the people who I was around would. And so I asked my yaya what she thought of it. And, you ask that sort of a question and you expect a response that's like sort of surprise or worry or whatnot. And I just remember her sitting there and be like, people who commit suicide, oh my God, they're just cowards. And again, I do not adopt that personal view. I'm going to say that right now. I do not adopt or ascribe that view, right? Obviously, people who do that sort of a thing, I'm not, like that as a whole, I'm not going to ascribe that. But it's important to the story because I was young enough that this had an effect on me to where from that point going on, I never saw suicide as a viable option because I always just thought back to, well, I want to make the people around me proud and respect me. And logistically, that is going to have the opposite intended effect. So I just did not acknowledge it as an option growing up. And that put me into sort of a weird spot, right? It put me into this weird spot of, well, I can't transition. And I can't, in my mindset, I cannot take my own life. And so, really, the only other option, at least how I perceived it at the time, I'm not sure how true this is, was to effectively do everything I can to otherwise mitigate the pain that I was experiencing, right? And the way I saw to do that was to become this person that, like, to basically man it up as much as possible, to become the epitome, to get the best version of a guy's life that you can, right? And again, obviously there are flaws with that sort of mentality, right? And more on that in a bit. But that's what I ran with for a while. And to my credit, I don't think I could have gotten over that mentality had I not sort of done it. When I was growing up in Huron, the thing about that town is that it is a football town, right? Everyone loves and reveres the football community, and that's the religion that people ascribe to primarily. Like, people are Christian, but more so the types of Christian that go to church every, couple days a year, usually on the holidays, and say that they're Christian but don't really read the Bible or ascribe or know much of the scripture. And I'm not saying that's a requirement, right? I'm not criticizing them for being of that sort of a faith. In hindsight, it probably had a better effect. In hindsight, that probably had a better effect on me growing up, since I didn't grow up in like a fundamental religious community, right? That could have gone over very poorly for me coming out. But no, what everyone ascribed to was high school football. And so I saw that and I was like, all right, well, step one, if I want to become a respected and liked person, I'm going to do that because people see me as a man, and that's what the men do. And so I did it, right? And the first couple of years, it was tough because I was this weak, kind of whatever kid. I didn't get much playing time, and it really frustrated me. And I was very close to quitting. I was very close to quitting during like my 7th and 8th grade years. Um, but that was before my father, like I basically talked to him and I was like, hey, um, you know, I'm thinking about quitting. It's really hard on me. What do you think? And he told me to give it another year, right? He told me to give it another year, and if I didn't like it, then hey, don't worry about it. And looking back, I do really appreciate that. My dad's an awesome person. That was what I needed to hear, I think, at that point. I mean, like, he also could have told me that I didn't need to continue anymore, and that would have been fine, and my life would be very different now, probably as a result. I'm gonna say that I kind of like how it went over. Let me explain. So, the next year, my freshman year, that was the first year I really saw any major playtime. I, believe it or not, was a lineman. And not only that, a tackle. Yeah, because, I'm super strong and all that. I used to be, right? HRT has a habit of, trans people, you know the story. But, yeah, no, back then, that was the first year where I actually started, and that means that you were the first person to go and you get the most playing time. It also means that you're one of the most respected people on the team. And that was the first time where people actually started really acknowledging me and looked to me as like this person to like respect and care about. And that was addicting, right? I saw that and I was like, holy crap, people for like the first time, outside of like my parents, actually care about me. Especially my peers, right? Like people in my grade, the kids that I was around, they actually respected me. And that was a feeling that I didn't really know before then. And so after that, I just doubled down, right? It also helped that, so next year, sophomore year, that was my first year of varsity, right? When I got into that, I really, I gave football everything that I had. And, I did everything I could in the classroom. And, at this point, you see sort of a general increase in what looks to be the quality of my life. And to be fair, it was a much better increase in quality of life from what it had been before. Sorry. It had been a drastic increase in quality of life from what it had been before, because like a bunch of stuff happened, right? I started getting more recognition, I got more play in football, I got more my confidence went up, so my grades went up, and puberty happened, and mom gave me some great genetics for being a guy. Yeah. A lot of people said I was fairly attractive. I did some male modeling for a little bit. And I didn't have any strong feelings about that, obviously. But I was like, all right, well, it's better than being a guy and, being rejected by other people for being unattractive, so, I'll take it. I think that the one thing that came out of football, though, that I didn't expect was that I actually really respected a lot of people who I ended up working with, right? While I got into the program for largely, the reasons we've talked about so far, achieving respect and love and admiration and all that. What I did not expect was that a lot of people, especially the coaches on the varsity program, are, some of the people who, to this day, I respect the most and have had very strong impacts on my person, right? The head coach of the program would always make a point to talk about the fact that, if you get so many kids together, right? If you get 60 some odd kids together and the only thing that you can do is win a couple football games, and you're doing them a disservice, right? You actually want, they have the goal of trying to instill in them good values and good morals, right? And I know that can be very subjective, but a lot of them I still adopt today, and some of them even help me get through transition. The one that I always think about is this idea of mental toughness, right? The coaches would always talk about, when we were training, when we were preparing for games and whatnot, for tournaments, what you do in the weight room is important, and getting physically stronger is important, and memorizing the plays is important, and all that's important. But the most important thing is to make yourself as mentally tough as possible, making it such that when things get really hard, and when you want to give up, and when you want to just say, oh, I've had enough, my body's at its limit, I can't take any more, that you can still keep going. And we won't get too deep into it. But there are a lot of instances during high school, both in regards to football and in regards to me being trans, where that really helped me a lot. There are a lot of times where I did just want to give up. There are a lot of times where I just want to be like, all right, on the field, there are a lot of times where I, my body just wanted to give in and collapse. Or, when I was at home, there are a lot of times where I wanted to give in and just, end it all. And there are the values that we talked about that Mayaya instilled in me when I was younger. But that's been a value which I think is much healthier, which has followed me and has supported me throughout the most recent years of my life as well. There have been a lot of points when I've been going through transition, when I have been dealing with systematic issues in society, when I've had to deal with losing people I've come out to, where that value has really come in handy, because there are a lot of times where, especially early on, I really heavily considered detransition, right? Just giving up and surrendering to a mediocre life of, making other people happy and meeting expectations and yada yada and so forth, right? And I can say definitively now that I'm glad that I didn't, right? I am so much happier now than I have ever been in my life so far, right? Looking at the whole picture. And this value that I got from this small town, from these few people in this football program in this small town in Ohio, has been really instrumental in helping me do that. When I was home over break, I actually had lunch with one of my coaches, my offensive line coach, and that went over surprisingly well. And I'm glad that it did, right? Because I do want to continue having a relationship to this program and to my hometown, right? Because I care about them. I care about the people there a lot. Because even though we've been through, even though it was a rough childhood growing up, and even though it was hard on me for a long time, I do credit that town with forming the basis of my person, right? And I'm proud of who I am, right? So, yeah, I don't know. And, I only like that town more since I've come out to them and I've only gotten positive feedback from them. So, yeah, that's a town that is constantly on my mind, like how they operate politically and, how they deal with these sorts of issues. And because I mean, there's a lot to be explored there. I'm not sure if I'll make other videos on them, on that town, maybe on specific stories from my childhood, a bit more specific than what I talked about here. But it's just interesting to me because what you have is this sort of very stereotypical example of small town America, right? And you have people who I was afraid would just outright reject me when I came out to them because they're centrist, and generally centrists tend to lean conservative. And they didn't. And all in all, they've been very good to me. Granted, they don't nearly know as much, and they make a lot of the same mistakes that most cis people do with trans and queer folk and all that. But their heart's in the right place, and over the past couple of years, the people who I've been around have gotten a lot better and are very open-minded and continue to strive towards understanding. So, yeah, I don't know. I guess this is just a sort of warm and fuzzy, but yeah, that's sort of my childhood growing up there in a nutshell. The next part of the story is when I went off to college, and originally I went there with, like, once upon a time I had the plan of going off to college and then going far enough away that I could come out and transition there as soon as I went there. But unfortunately that story did not go over, or that plan did not go over as intended, but that's a story for another day. So I will leave it there. Thank you for watching, and yeah, comment, subscribe, do whatever. I'll try to upload weekly. That's what I would like to do, is upload at least like once a weekend. This doesn't take too long for me to do, but again, it always just depends on how the semester goes over. Just bear with me. I appreciate it. Love you, fam, and see you around. Peace.